Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Noah's powerful declaration to protect Sienna erupted through the room like a shockwave, raw, fierce, and utterly unrestrained, shattering whatever fragile peace had lingered in the Newman house and leaving Nick and Sharon staring at their son as if they no longer recognized him, as if he had transformed into someone forged in fire rather than the gentle, steady presence they'd always believed him to be. It began with a tremor in the air, an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks as secrets stacked on secrets, lies knotted themselves into the family's foundations, and Sienna, harboring wounds she tried to cloak in cold control, stood at the center of a storm she never meant to unleash, a storm that had begun long before she crossed paths with Noah, long before whispers of her past began to claw their way into the light. Nick had paced the living room floor with the restless energy of a man preparing for battle. Sharon had folded her arms tight against her chest as if crossing her heart behind her ribcage, and Noah had stood between them with Sienna beside him, her shoulders pulled in defensively, her eyes flickering with the same panic that had haunted her since her darkest truths had begun to surface. They demanded answers. Where had she been disappearing to? Why did danger seem to follow her? How could Noah, their son, their boy, attach himself to a woman tangled in scandal and shadows? And Noah had listened, jaw clenched, until finally, when Nick muttered that Sienna was dragging him into something he couldn't possibly understand, Noah snapped. His voice rose, not in anger but in the kind of razor-sharp conviction that could split steel, declaring that he would protect Sienna no matter what, that he believed her when she said she was being hunted by forces far more twisted than any of them realized, that he wouldn't stand by and let the world tear her apart just because her past frightened them, because her trauma made them uncomfortable, because her secrets didn't come packaged in the neat, respectable boxes that the Newmans had always clung to. He said he would rather burn every Newman bridge than watch Sienna suffer alone. He said he loved her. He said he knew her truth even when she struggled to voice it herself. And in that single roaring declaration, in that moment where his heart detonated in front of them all, the ties that bound the family began to splinter. Sharon's face went pale. She tried to speak, but the words stuck somewhere between fear and disbelief. Nick's reaction was a full-bodied fury, his voice booming as he accused Noah of being manipulated, blindsided, used. He spat that Sienna had been lying from the moment she arrived, that she was poison wrapped in fragility, that Noah was sacrificing himself for someone who didn't deserve it. But Noah pushed back harder, standing firm, louder than his father's outrage, insisting that the only poison in the room was the judgment they were pouring over a woman who had never had anyone fight for her. Sienna shook as she listened. She tried to tell Noah to stop, to let her take whatever blame they threw her way, to not risk everything for her. But Noah denied her that escape. He lifted his voice even higher, confessing that she mattered to him in ways he couldn't undo, vowing that he would face every threat, every accusation, every ghost from her past alongside her. The stunning intensity of that declaration cracked open the carefully controlled facade Sharon had held. She began pleading with him, tears pooling in her eyes, saying he was too good, too kind, too vulnerable to be pulled into Sienna's chaos. But Noah countered that it wasn't chaos, it was pain, and he wouldn't abandon someone carrying wounds she had been punished for long enough. What he didn't say, but what everyone felt, was that in protecting Sienna, he was also rebelling against every moment in his life where he'd been expected to fit the Newman mold, to follow unwritten rules, to behave according to standards that had long suffocated him. And as his words echoed through the dimly lit room, Nick's fury deepened into something darker, betrayal. He accused Noah of choosing Sienna over family. Noah replied that protecting the innocent, even the misunderstood, was family, that compassion meant nothing if it only applied when convenient. The argument escalated, rising like a wildfire, each side certain they were right, each side bleeding for different reasons, while Sienna, overwhelmed, whispered that she never wanted any of this, that she had tried so hard not to drag him into the depths she was drowning in. Noah stepped closer to her, taking her trembling hand, raising his chin at his parents in a silent challenge that spoke louder than any words. She isn't alone anymore. I'm not abandoning her. And that was the moment Sharon broke. She begged him not to do this, not to throw himself away, not to let love blind him to danger. But Noah insisted he wasn't blind. He saw Sienna more clearly than he had ever seen anyone in his life. He saw her guilt, her trauma, her courage, her desperation to protect others even at great cost to herself. He saw the truth she couldn't bear to voice, that she never believed she deserved to be loved, let alone fiercely defended. And when he declared that protecting her was his choice, not a mistake forced upon him, something inside Nick snapped. The room vibrated with tension as Nick warned that if Noah walked down this path with Sienna, he would be choosing a life tangled in threats, enemies, and consequences far beyond his control. Noah simply answered that he had already chosen. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick enough to steal breath, and for a moment even the shadows seemed to recoil. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Not until Sharon, voice trembling, whispered the question that hung like a knife, "Are you really willing to lose us over this?" And Noah, heart pounding, chest tight, looked between the two people who had raised him and the woman who had given him a new reason to fight, and he said yes, not because he wanted to lose them, but because he refused to lose Sienna. His declaration shook Sienna more than all the accusations hurled before it. Tears slipped down her cheeks because she had never been fought for, never been shielded, never been loved so fiercely that someone would willingly stand against their own blood for her. She tried to pull her hand from his, but Noah held tighter, grounding her, promising silently that he wasn't leaving. Sharon collapsed onto the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands, devastated not only by Noah's choice but by the realization that they had never seen this version of their son before, unyielding, fierce, unstoppable. Nick, breathing hard, stared at him with a mixture of anger and heartbreak, unable to comprehend how quickly their once unbreakable bond was unraveling. The fracture spread deeper when Noah accused them of being blinded by their own fear, of refusing to believe that Sienna might be a victim instead of a threat, of ignoring the signs that she was running from something far worse than any of them could imagine. He said she wasn't asking for their trust, he was. And still, they refused. That was when Noah's voice softened into something almost mournful, as if he already felt the loss settling into his bones. He told them that love wasn't supposed to be conditional. He told them that if they could only support him when his choices made sense to them, then maybe the family bond they all worshipped wasn't as strong as they claimed. Those words struck deeper than anger ever could. Nick went silent. Sharon froze. And Sienna, sobbing now, begged Noah to stop pushing them away because of her. But Noah shook his head gently, whispering that she wasn't the reason, she was simply the first person who had shown him how willing he was to fight for what mattered. The room pulsed with the weight of his conviction. The fracture in the family bond became undeniable, a crack too wide, too deep, too raw to ignore. Noah stepped back with Sienna, his hands still enveloping hers as if anchoring her in a world she no longer trusted. Nick finally asked him one question, voice hard and disbelieving, "You'd stand against your own family?" And Noah, with unwavering calm, answered, "I'll stand against anyone who tries to hurt the person I love." That declaration turned the tension into something final. Sharon whispered his name desperately, Nick cursed under his breath, Sienna sobbed harder, but Noah stood resolute, shoulders squared, as if he had stepped fully into adulthood in the span of a single sentence. In the silence that followed, something colder than anger seeped into the room, the realization that the Newman family would never be the same again, that a line had been drawn, and that Sienna, whether she wanted to or not, had become the dividing point. Noah guided her toward the door, away from the suffocating accusations, away from the judgment, away from the gasps and heartbreak. And as they stepped out, leaving behind the fractured remains of what once had been a united family, Noah whispered one final vow to Sienna, a vow that echoed into the house long after the door closed. "I'm not afraid of your past. I'm afraid of a future without you." And with that, the fracture became permanent, a deep, echoing rupture that left Nick and Sharon staring at the empty doorway, realizing that their fury had cost them something far more irreplaceable than they ever anticipated. But the second the door shut behind Noah and Sienna, the house seemed to exhale in a broken, uneven gasp, the kind that follows an emotional earthquake, shaking loose dust, memories, expectations, the very foundation of everything the Newmans believed they could control. Sharon sat frozen, trembling, her hands still pressed against her face, unable to process how rapidly her world had tilted. Nick stood rigid, fists clenched, staring at the place where his son had stood moments before, trying to latch onto some justification that could explain Noah's transformation, his sudden spine of steel, his absolute refusal to bend. Nick had always taught his children to fight for what mattered, family, integrity, love, but he had never expected those lessons to turn around and cut him so deeply. Sharon finally lifted her head, eyes swollen with heartbreak, and whispered that Noah wasn't thinking clearly, that something must have happened, something they weren't seeing, that pushed him into this fierce, almost feral protectiveness. Nick wanted to agree, but the truth sat like a stone in his gut. Noah had been thinking clearly. Too clearly. There had been no confusion in his voice, no uncertainty in his stance. Only conviction. And that terrified Nick more than Sienna ever could. He slammed his palm against the table, the sound cracking like a gunshot through the room, and muttered that they had to do something before Noah sank any deeper into Sienna's darkness, before he lost himself completely. Sharon flinched at Nick's anger, but what crushed her more was the realization that their son had already crossed a line she couldn't drag him back from. He chose her, Sharon whispered, her voice wobbling with disbelief. He chose her over us. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, foreign and heavy, as if she were saying them in a nightmare rather than real life. But Nick refused to see it that way. He argued that Noah didn't choose Sienna, he was manipulated, coerced, swept up in a whirlwind of secrets and danger he wasn't equipped to handle. He insisted that Sienna must have known exactly what she was doing when she latched onto their son, that she must have crafted her vulnerability like a weapon, using her trauma as a shield to blind Noah. But deep down, Sharon wasn't convinced. She had seen the way Sienna shook, the way her breath hitched in fragmented gasps, the way her eyes darted around the room as if she expected harm from every direction. That wasn't the behavior of a strategist manipulating her way into the Newman family. That was the behavior of someone who had lived too long with fear as her closest companion. Sharon didn't say that aloud, Nick wouldn't have heard it anyway, but she felt it deep in her bones. And so she sat there in the dim light of the living room, heart fractured, wondering when exactly they had stopped truly listening to their son, when their fear of Sienna's past had overshadowed the fact that Noah had finally found something, or someone, he believed in. Outside, meanwhile, Noah and Sienna had made it only a few steps down the walkway before Sienna collapsed under the weight of everything that had just erupted inside. She clutched Noah's arm as if the ground beneath her had turned to water, her breath trembling with panic. He held her instantly, wrapping her in a fierce, protective embrace that felt nothing like the gentle comfort he used to offer in quieter moments. This was something different, something battle-forged, urgent, desperate. She choked out that she never wanted him to fight with his parents, that she wasn't worth it, that she had brought nothing but chaos and danger into his life. But Noah, still burning with the raw energy of his declaration, cupped her face and told her she didn't get to decide what she was worth to him, that she didn't get to erase herself from his future just because she believed she was broken. His voice softened only for her, even as his heart still thundered with defiance. He told her he would rather face every enemy from her past than watch her walk away and pretend she didn't deserve a place beside him. Sienna shook her head, tears spilling over, insisting he didn't understand the magnitude of what he was stepping into, that the people chasing her weren't just dangerous, they were relentless, that choosing her meant choosing constant threat, choosing a life where safety was no longer a guarantee, choosing fear. But Noah met her fear with unwavering determination, telling her that fear meant nothing compared to losing her. He said he had never felt so certain of anything in his life, not his job, not his future, not even his place in the Newman family, and the realization stunned him even as he spoke it. For years, Noah had drifted, searching for meaning, for purpose, for a feeling that ignited him. And somehow, impossibly, Sienna had lit that spark. She saw the doubt twist across her face, so he held her tighter and said that if his parents couldn't see the truth of who she was, then he would simply have to be enough for both of them until they came to their senses. His voice trembled with the force of it, but his stance was solid. And that was the moment something inside Sienna broke, not in the way it had broken her in the past, but in a way that finally began to stitch her back together. Because for the first time in her life, someone wasn't running from her scars. Someone was standing guard over them. Inside, the debate between Nick and Sharon had quieted into something slower, heavier, more dangerous. Sharon whispered that pushing Noah harder would only drive him further away. Nick countered that if they didn't intervene now, Noah might never come back at all. Sharon's voice wavered as she asked whether Nick cared more about being right or being a father in that moment, and Nick recoiled as if she had slapped him. He barked that everything he was doing, every word, every warning, was because he was a father trying to keep his son alive. But the fire in his eyes dimmed when Sharon, with heartbreaking softness, told him that being a father also meant trusting that they raised Noah well enough to make his own decisions. The argument fizzled, leaving only the ache of failure behind. Nick grabbed his coat, muttering that he needed air, that he needed to think, that he couldn't breathe in the house where Noah had abandoned them. Sharon reached for him, then let her hand drop, realizing she didn't have the strength to stop him. As he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Sharon sank to the floor, knees folding beneath her, overwhelmed by the crushing sense that their family had just entered a war with no clear enemy, no clear battlefield, and no clear way to win. Meanwhile, Noah guided Sienna to his car, the cold evening air swirling around them like a witness to their unraveling world. Sienna begged him to reconsider, begged him not to sever ties with his parents on her behalf, begged him to understand that she wasn't worth the cost. But Noah silenced her, not with anger, but with a quiet, fierce certainty that left her breathless. He told her that he wasn't cutting ties, he was giving his parents space to process, time to realize that love couldn't survive if it was built on conditions and boundaries that ignored his happiness. He said the Newmans were stubborn, fierce, protective, but so was he. And his parents would eventually see that choosing Sienna didn't mean choosing against them. It meant choosing himself for the first time. Sienna stared at him with watery eyes, overwhelmed by the conviction she couldn't understand, couldn't believe she deserved, yet desperately needed. Noah brushed a tear from her cheek, whispering that she had spent so long surviving that she didn't know how to let someone stand beside her. But he wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not after everything. And especially not after watching his parents treat her like a threat when all he saw was someone who had been threatened for far too long. When he kissed her forehead gently, she collapsed into him once more, fingers curling into his jacket, silently pleading with the universe not to take this away. Back inside, Sharon finally rose from the floor and whispered to the empty house that she couldn't lose her child, not again, not like this. She vowed to find a way to reach him, to fix the fracture, to understand what Noah saw in Sienna that everyone else had missed. Because despite her fear, despite her heartbreak, Sharon felt the one thing Nick couldn't yet: Noah's love for Sienna wasn't reckless. It was raw, intense, overwhelming, but it wasn't blind. It was real. And real love, Sharon knew too well, had the power to destroy, but also the power to heal. As the night deepened and silence settled over the Newman home like a blanket of regret, Noah and Sienna disappeared into the darkness, not running, not hiding, but walking into a future neither of them knew how to navigate. Yet they held on to each other as if their intertwined hands were the only compass they had left. And behind them, Nick and Sharon faced a future they could never have predicted, a future where protecting their son meant learning to trust him, even when his choices terrified them. But for now, the only thing certain was this: Noah's declaration had not just fractured the family bond, it had rewritten it entirely. Yet even as Noah drove away with Sienna curled against the passenger seat, trembling and silent, a new tension coiled inside him, something sharper than fear, heavier than guilt. It was the awareness that tonight had changed everything, that he had crossed a threshold he could never step back over. Sienna sensed it too. She watched him from the corner of her eye, her breath still unsteady, and whispered that she didn't want to be the reason he lost his family. But Noah shook his head firmly, telling her that love wasn't lost unless you let it be, and he refused to let fear dictate the rest of their lives. Still, the weight of the night pressed against them, thick and unforgiving, as if the universe itself had paused to see what they would do next. Behind them, Sharon stood alone at the living room window, fingers pressed against the glass as she watched her son's car disappear into the dark. She whispered a prayer, half plea, half apology, that he would come back to them when the time was right, and that Sienna's past wouldn't swallow him whole. But somewhere deep inside, Sharon also understood something Nick hadn't yet grasped. Noah wasn't a boy to be protected anymore. Tonight, he had become a man willing to fight for his own truth. And that terrified her even more.